Hey everybody, welcome again. I'm Jesse Lee, the Online Programs Director here with the White House. Here with an old pro with these chats. It's Ben Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications. Today we're talking about something. It's the release of the National Security Strategy. Obviously nobody needs a reminder that's kind of turbulent times right now. And essentially that is that there's a lot going on today. But this is kind of a comprehensive document. We thought it was good to kind of sit down, take your questions on it, get people familiar with it who haven't heard a lot about it today. So Ben, you want to talk a little bit about kind of the context and what this is exactly?
Sure. Thanks, Jesse, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Each administration is required by Congress to submit a national security strategy. It tends to be submitted every 4 years in the second year of a new administration. It's meant to lay out the administration's strategic approach to national security, as well as outlining our approach on a series of priority issues. So what this document gives us an opportunity to do is, in the kind of challenging context that Jesse describes, we can address how we're dealing with those immediate issues that we all care so much about. For instance, our efforts to end the war in Iraq responsibly, to successfully prosecute our war in Afghanistan, to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda and its affiliates around the world. However, what this document also allows us to do is maybe look beyond those challenges, over the horizon a bit, to where we're trying to get to, what the kind of vision of American leadership is that we're advancing in the world. And in this instance, the President has a strategy that's focused on building the sources of America's strength and influence at home, and using American leadership to shape an international order, a set of international cooperation that can effectively deal with the challenges of the 21st century, whether it's nuclear proliferation, growing the global economy, combating climate change, of course countering violent extremism around the world. I'll just say a few points by way of introduction before I take your questions. I think one of the things that's different about this national security strategy is it takes a broad conception of national security. It emphasizes that our security and our leadership in the world begins with what we do at home. As the President has said, the foundation of our strength in the world is our economy. That was true in the last century and has to be true in the 21st as well. So what we underscore in the document is the importance of investing in those areas of our economy that will make us competitive in the 21st century and will allow us to lead. So for instance, in a global marketplace, our citizens will be competing against counterparts around the world for jobs and opportunity. Therefore, our ability to provide a world-class education for our people is fundamental to our national security and our strength and leadership in the 21st century. Similarly, given the importance of energy in the 21st century, we place an emphasis on developing new forms of clean energy, which of course can help advance our economy, create new jobs and industries, but also enhance our energy security and independence and be a critical part of our effort to combat climate change. Similarly, there's a focus on science and technology, which we've been focused on since the beginning of this administration through the investments we made in the Recovery Act, for instance, because our science and technological leadership in the 20th century really helped underpin our strength. Not only does that service our national security capabilities in the military and in other areas, but it also services our economic leadership. And that's even truer today with a broader array of competitors around the world. So we focus on the foundation of American strength and leadership in this document. We also talk about developing a broader and integrated set of national security capabilities. Of course, America maintains a strong military advantage in the world and will sustain that military advantage. But we also talk in this document about developing a broader set of capabilities as relates to our diplomacy, our development around the world, our intelligence and law enforcement capabilities as well. And what we want to do there is have the ability to resolve problems, overcome challenges in new and different ways. That might, for instance, involve having diplomacy and development experts who can operate in more dangerous places, whether it's in conflict areas like Iraq and Afghanistan, post-conflict areas in Africa and other places, so that we are both lessening the burden on our military while also strengthening other forms of American power that can advance our own interests and the interests of other peoples around the world. We also underscore our engagement policy in this document. Obviously, the foundation of our engagement around the world is our relationships with our allies, those nations who share interests, share values with the United States of America, and with whom we cooperate on all the pressing priorities that we're trying to address. However, we also underscore the fact that in the 21st century, there are important relationships with other major powers that the United States must cultivate. So for instance, we underscored the importance of our cooperation with nations like China and India and Russia, with whom we have to work together to address something like non-proliferation or the global economy or climate change, because no one nation alone can solve the challenges of the 21st century, which are inherently transnational in nature and require coordinated action. Similarly, there's going to be new nations at the table, emerging powers in every region of the world. So we expand our engagement to include deepening partnerships with those countries like Indonesia and South Africa and Brazil, who might be playing a greater role in their regions and in the world. An example of how we operationalize that through institutions and arrangements is that we've now moved the focus of our international economic activity from the G8, which is the United States and our European allies and Canada and Japan, to the G20, which is a broader spectrum of nations to include China and India, Indonesia, South Africa, and a range of other nations. We feel that's essential because if you're going to deal with the global economic crisis, if you're going to try to foster sustained economic growth, you need to have America's traditional close friends and allies at the table, but you're also going to have those other nations at the table as well. So that's what we've done throughout the course of the last year on the global economy. Similarly, to address a challenge like climate change, it's going to take a broader set of cooperation in the world. So not only do we need to coordinate closely with our allies in Europe and Asia and around the world, but we're also going to need to bring into an international climate framework nations like China and India too, to reduce their emissions. And we've done that so far through the Copenhagen Accord and the steps that we've taken since then to try to foster a truly global response to the challenge of climate change, which we'll continue to work at. And of course, on an issue like the proliferation of nuclear weapons, it's not an issue that the United States can deal with by itself, but rather needs to be able to deal with in an international context. So since we came into office, we've been focused on fostering better international cooperation on non-proliferation. You've seen the United States and Russia sign a landmark new arms control treaty, the START Treaty, which both addresses reductions in our own nuclear arsenals, but demonstrates US and Russian leadership and support for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the binding document that stops the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. You've seen us host a summit here in Washington, where the President brought together the leaders of 47 nations behind his goal of securing all vulnerable nuclear material around the world within 4 years, so it can never fall into the wrong hands. That kind of international action is what's going to be demanded if we're going to deal with challenges that, again, can flow across borders. And lastly, you're going to need that kind of international action to make sure that those nations that violate the rules of the road are held to account. So, for instance, our efforts to pursue sanctions on North Korea, which we did last year for their continued failure to meet their obligations with regard to their nuclear program, demanded cooperation among a broad cross-section of nations. And currently, we're pursuing sanctions on Iran at the Security Council, which we would not be able to pursue without the support of our European allies, but also Russia and China and other nations. So what we're trying to foster is an international order with the US leadership at the center of it that is capable of dealing with these challenges effectively. Because many of the international institutions, alliances, frameworks that were established were designed in the 20th century when the threats and challenges that we faced were far more different than those that we face today. So what the strategy is really focused on is using, again, American leadership to foster more effective international cooperation while retaining America's unique capability to defend the American people through our military strength and through a broader set of national security capabilities. So with that, Jesse, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Well, let's start. We took a bunch of questions on Facebook ahead of the chat, and we've got some good general ones. But I feel like it's always good to start with one from the chat. And this might be a bit of a pop quiz, but it's from Jason Siemel-Yuski. Sorry about that. Could you expand upon the, quote, strengthening national capacity concept starting on page 14 and continuing on to page 15? With particular regard to diplomatic personnel and non-state actors, corporations mainly, he says.
Sure. Well, Jason, it's a really good question, and it gets to what I was speaking about, which is that we need really a whole of government approach in which we're using all of the different tools that our government has to advance American interests, protect our people, and to cooperate around the world. Our military, for instance, has borne an extraordinary burden these last several years since 9/11. Fighting 2 wars and a global effort against Al-Qaeda. At the same time, we would like diplomatic capabilities that are more expeditionary so that our diplomats can operate again effectively in capitals around the world engaging their counterparts, but can also operate in more dangerous places. So right now, for instance, in Afghanistan, we've more than doubled the amount of civilians that we have on the ground working in areas like improving Afghan agriculture, Afghan governance. They need new capabilities to be able to do that, and also to be able to work on a complementary basis with our military. Similarly, we need our diplomats to be able to project their own abilities, and our development experts for that matter, to help foster capacity building in the developing world as well. Because a lot of our development challenges in the 21st century are going to involve building the capacity of our partners. In Africa, for instance, we're pursuing a food security initiative and a global health initiative that is designed in part to strengthen the capacity of our African nation partners to develop their own capabilities to feed their populations, to advance their public health programs. So we need to make sure that we have the capacity in our own government to support capacity building in other governments as well. On our intelligence and homeland security and law enforcement side, what we need to do is not just have the ability to operate effectively in many different places, but the ability for them to share information, to work on an integrated basis so that they can connect pieces of information from various sources. So for instance, given the threat of terrorism, you may need the ability for an intelligence agency that has information from a foreign country to be able to immediately connect that information to activities taking place in the United States that maybe the FBI has, and then to disseminate that information to local law enforcement so that they can disrupt a terrorist plot. So there needs to be very effective information sharing, a very effective integration of the ability of our national security agencies to work together. When you talk about the non-state piece of this, I think one of the things that the strategy recognizes is the best asset that the United States has really is the American people. And that in the 21st century, as we deal with a globalized world that we're in, there are increasing connections between the American people and peoples around the world. In the private sector, universities, non-governmental organizations, and citizens. And the US government should support those efforts, for instance, through education exchange programs. So we're providing more opportunities for students to go abroad, or perhaps by convening private sector or non-governmental organizations behind a goal. So for instance, we had a summit here in Washington recently that was dedicated to entrepreneurship, where the United States hosted over 200 people from many Muslim majority nations around the world, connected them with foundations, with private sector leaders, to discuss how to best foster opportunity around the world. Because we believe, again, there's a great amount of innovation, a great amount of interest outside of government in advancing better connections and better relations with peoples and governments around the world. So what the government can do is try to open doors and facilitate those connections, because what we believe the best ambassadors for the United States are our own people, and to the extent to which we are encouraging them to, again, pursue deeper relations with their counterparts around the world, that will serve the interests of the United States, and it will serve the interests of the wider world as well.
All right, thanks a lot, and I think that answers a good example that, you know, maybe this document actually is well worth reading. You can find it on the White House blog right now, and that's whitehouse.gov/blog. And also, I should have noted up front that I'm not sitting here looking at my email or anything. I'm reading your questions in the chat. So go ahead, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'm plucking some of the best ones and doing my best not to cherry pick or anything to ask Ben here. This is actually a good one and kind of a tough one, I think. Charlie Exeta asks, blueprints work only when employed prior to assembly. Considering administration is nearly halfway through the term, what exactly is the point of issuing an incredibly broad manifesto on security? Shouldn't a series of small battles and small victories serve better? And I think there's kind of a good question underlying that of, you know, when there are these kind of broad statements, what's kind of the relationship between those broad statements and kind of the day-to-day decisions that have to be made?
Yeah. It's a good question, Charlie, and I'd encourage you to look through the document. One of the interesting things about it is it does get directly at your question, which is if you flip through it, you'll find in many instances it is a catalog of what we are already doing. You know, it addresses the approaches that we've already begun to take on a range of issues. Again, whether it's how we're ending the war in Iraq, whether it's the strategy we're pursuing in Afghanistan and Pakistan, whether it's some of the things I spoke about with regard to education and energy have been priorities since day one, and were represented by historic investments in the Recovery Act. On climate change, we took efforts last year to bring the United States to the table at the Major Economies Forum, which brought together all the world's largest economies to address how to reduce our emissions, or in Copenhagen. So if you look through the document, what you'll find is on each of the kind of big priority issues that you all are probably familiar with, as well as some that people may be less familiar with, it captures actions that we are indeed already taking, as well as goals that we've set for the future. And so what the document can do is it can bring all of that together and put into a framework of what does this all mean and where are we trying to get to? And what does this say about our vision of American leadership in the world? Again, an America that is building the sources of its own strength and influence, and that is trying to employ its leadership to foster better international coordination and cooperation on pressing challenges. So it's a unique document in that it does capture what we're doing. It also captures where we're trying to go. And I think that, frankly, if you pick it up a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, it will serve as a good tool to hold us accountable and to say what progress is being made. The administration laid out these goals. It said it was going to pursue this course of action. How are they doing? And I think that here internally, we'll look forward to using it in that respect, to pick it up 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, and say, we've laid out this strategy for development. We've laid out this strategy for advancing our values. We've laid out this strategy for dealing with the threat of climate change. And we can measure the progress that we've made against the commitments and approaches we've laid out in this document.
Okay. One other thing I'd say is I see somebody saying that they're having trouble with the sound. If you go to whitehouse.gov/live, there's another feed of the same video. You can just keep that open in one window, keep the chat open in this one. So this question, we've got asked a couple different ways. We got, and I'll go ahead and ask both of them. Rashid Dar just asked, there seems to be a renewed commitment to international institutions in the new NSS. Involvement in international institutions has arguably been viewed with a lot of apprehension as it ostensibly involves giving up a degree of sovereignty, such as in the WTO, the ICC, etc. Is the U.S. willing to be more of a team player in international institutions, even if it isn't always to our advantage? Mike Henning, previously to the chat starting, asked it this way. Gordon Brown and Obama are chanting the same globalist stuff of an international order. They'll claim it would be for security and no more war. Grievance and war will soon follow. So maybe you can kind of answer that in both directions a little bit.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to put this into context. Because first of all, I think it's important to note that the United States has operated within international institutions and the architecture of international treaties and standards and alliances for a long time now. In fact, at arguably the point of our maximum strength and power in the world, the aftermath of World War II, we had a choice. We could have just taken our power and continued on. Instead, we chose to lead at that moment in time to build the architecture of institutions that would see us through the Cold War. The United States took the lead in building the United Nations, in building NATO to be our premier security alliance, in building an architecture of international monetary and financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So we've channeled American leadership into these international institutions. And frankly, they saw us through the Cold War very well. And in many instances, they succeeded in keeping the peace. Of course, in a world of imperfect human beings, no institution, no organization, no alliance, no nation for that matter is going to have an absolutely perfect record. But we have found that given the choice, we've often done better when we've worked through these kinds of frameworks. I think what's happened today is we agree completely and acknowledge that there are deep problems with the architecture of international cooperation that exists right now. In some ways that's understandable. As the President said in Oslo, that international architecture, which was designed largely in the aftermath of World War II, is buckling under the weight of new threats, because the people that designed these mechanisms for cooperation were not foreseeing the threat of terrorism on an international basis, or the threat of climate change, or a global economy in which the actions that take place in one nation can affect all nations. So we basically have a choice. We can see the flaws in the international architecture, and essentially decide to step outside of them and to deal with these threats and challenges by ourselves. The problem is that when we do that, we place basically an unsustainable burden on the United States to deal with those challenges. We lose the force multiplier that comes with cooperating with other nations. We also, frankly, fail to acknowledge a reality, which is that no nation can deal with these challenges by their own. The United States alone cannot deny safe haven to Al-Qaeda around the world. Al-Qaeda is a group that's metastasized in many nations, and if we don't have the cooperation of a Pakistan or a Yemen, there's no way that we're going to be able to deny that safe haven. The United States alone, by definition, could never deal with a threat like climate change, which is truly global in nature. So what this document does is it acknowledges in a very hard-headed way the flaws in the international system, but says that we therefore need to channel our leadership to make this work better. That means new arrangements, again, like the G20, which is a broader collection of nations that can deal with the international economy. We need to develop new frameworks for dealing with climate change, which is what we're trying to pursue out of Copenhagen, and which we're bringing together Europe, the United States, also China, India, and nations around the world to deal with climate change. And we need to strengthen the non-proliferation regime, including the non-proliferation treaty, so that, again, an arrangement that was designed in the Cold War can deal with the reality today of nations that are outliers and violators of that agreement, and how we held them accountable and how we provide more incentives for them to move into international norms. And the bottom line is what we want to do is we want to incentivize responsible action. So nations have incentives to, again, operate within the international system, to cooperate, and that those nations that operate outside of it and are in violation of their obligations face some form of accountability and isolation. So, the theory of our case here is that, given the global nature of our challenges, that we share more interests with other nations than in many cases our own habits reflect, and that what we need to do is build a broader consensus for international collaboration and cooperation to deal with those mutual interests. The only thing I'd add is that the United States, like any other nation, will take whatever actions necessary to protect our interests. However, we also feel like, generally speaking, we're better served when we can act with other nations. It allows us to share burdens with other nations and allows us to deal with challenges that, again, run freely across borders in a globalized world.
Okay, getting through as many questions as we can. Try to just get to a couple more. I know Ben's got a long schedule ahead of him. I think I have to ask a question. It's a question that came up a lot in our questions that were submitted beforehand, and this is kind of one of the less hot versions of it. But Andrew Edidayo Editoye asked, I am particularly concerned about the administration's broad policies for immigration. I want the Deputy National Security Advisor to link the issue of immigrants to the U.S. and U.S. immigration programs to the new national security strategy.
Oh, sure. Well, there are obviously many facets to immigration. As the President has said, we have a great tradition of being a nation of laws and immigrants. I guess I'd address a couple of instances that could be relevant to the national security strategy. First of all, we see immigrants as having enriched American society, not just by enriching our diversity, that is a strength of the United States, but frankly as enriching our society and our economy. The United States has benefited by having some of the best and brightest come here from around the world to pursue their dreams, and having hardworking people come here to pursue their dreams. So the ability of the United States to remain open to the world really helps us advance our economic growth and our leadership. It also, frankly, helps us foster some of our connections around the world. Currently, there are many ethnic groups here in the United States who've, again, enriched our society, but also maintained very close connections to their home countries. In a globalized world, that can serve to America's advantage because, again, in a world of globalization, you have to operate in a global marketplace. And so we believe that those connections are a strength of the United States. On the specific question of security, of course, we need to ensure, though, that we are a nation of laws, that our borders are secure, that we do not have a continuous flow of people across, for instance, our southern border. So on the security side of that aspect, we need to make sure that as we remain a nation of immigrants, we're also a nation of laws and a nation that's secure. Which is why we've been taking steps to increase security on our border, including President Obama's recent announcement that there'll be 1,200 National Guard deployed on our border as well. So there's the balance to it that we're pursuing. Of course, we reaffirm in the document that a comprehensive immigration reform approach is the best approach, one that again secures our border, provides for legal immigration here to the United States, and provides a path forward for those here who are in the United States to pursue citizenship. So that again is embodied in the document as well.
Okay, I think maybe we have time for one more.
I can take a couple more.
We'll do a couple more then. Well, one good question was from Jessica Allen, who asked how ending the war in Iraq kind of fits into this broader strategy.
Sure, it's a good question, Jessica. The administration, of course, is ending the war in Iraq consistent with the plan that the president laid out shortly after taking office. That plan involves us ending our combat mission in Iraq by the end of August. So after August, the Iraqi security forces will have the lead responsibility for security in the country. After August, we'll maintain a much smaller force of U.S. forces than when we took office. When we took office, there were roughly 150,000 troops. We're down to about 90 now. We should be down to, we're on target to be down to under 50,000 troops at the end of August when we end our combat mission. Those troops will be there to continue to advise and assist the Iraqi security forces, who we've helped train and equip as they've taken responsibility for the country. They will continue to draw down, and we have a commitment to remove all of our troops from Iraq by the end of 2011. How that fits into our broader strategy is part of what we lay out in this document is a rebalancing of American resources. We've had such a commitment of military deployments overseas that, again, as a nation, like any nation that has finite resources, when you're pursuing that kind of commitment, it lessens your ability to do other things, whether that is focusing on other national security challenges like Al-Qaeda in other countries, or non-proliferation, or some of the other challenges that I addressed earlier, or whether it's focusing on the investments we need to make in our economy, such as the ones I discussed before in energy and education and other instances. So by drawing down our forces in Iraq, we're not only enabling a transition to a stable and sovereign and self-reliant Iraq, we're also bringing down our resource commitment and better enabling us to rebalance those resources in other areas that we believe are critical to national security and that are embedded in this document. And so I think that's a critical point, as I talked about at the beginning, looking over the horizon of where we're trying to get to, and where we're trying to get to when we've ended the war in Iraq and we've gone over the curve in Afghanistan. And again, we can begin to focus on a broad set of priorities that again are encompassed in the document and that we're already focusing on and that we're going to be continuing to focus on into the future.
Okay, so I think this is a good one to close out on, and I think it'll probably hit at an important point in kind of the president's general, defense and national security philosophy. But Matthew Clancy asked during the chat, please discuss the administration's approach to religious fundamentalism, specifically Islamic.
Sure. Well, I think what the document makes clear is that the United States is at war right now. We're not at war with a tactic, terrorism. There are many, many terrorist groups around the world in many different regions with many different ideologies and agendas. We're not at war with the tactic of terrorism and all of those terrorist groups. Similarly, we're not at war with the religion of Islam, which of course is a great world religion of well over 1 billion people. However, we are at war, and we are relentlessly waging a war against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, who are a specific network of terrorist organizations that pose a direct threat to the United States and the American people, as well as many of our allies and partners around the world. And that's why we focused our attention on Al-Qaeda and their affiliates in Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular, and then working with partners so that we can dismantle those networks around the world. Al-Qaeda purports to be religious leaders. They would like to be perceived as leaders within Islam, but they're not, because Islam itself is not compatible with people who would murder innocent men, women, and children to advance their own agenda. So as the president said at West Point, we do not recognize Al-Qaeda as leaders of any religion. We see them as terrorists, and that's why we're at war with them, and that's because they directly threaten the United States of America and continue to plot attacks against us. So I think what the document does is focus when we talk about the United States being at war, it focuses us as to who we're at war with, which again is a very specific network, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, who unfortunately continue to pose a threat to us, but who we are steadily pursuing, again, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and many nations around the world. I think the other thing, just as a note to end on, that this document does is there's obviously a very intense focus on terrorism, on the wars we've been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan among the American people, understandably so, when there's such an extraordinary sacrifice that our men and women in uniform have been making over these last several years. And I think what this document can do is also address that effort, and also they'll put it into a broad context. Because if you survey the world today, there are many issues that are going to define the next several years and several decades. Terrorism is one of them, but it's not the only one. We also, again, face the threat from the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We face a danger from climate change. We need to make sure that the global economy is growing in a balanced and sustained way and is not subject to the kind of economic crisis that we've just passed through. We also need to seize opportunities to advance development around the world in a way that can be mutually beneficial to the United States and, of course, to developing countries. Opportunities to promote our values, to support human rights around the world, both as it relates to supporting democracies, emerging democracies, as they develop their institutions and as they struggle with issues like the rule of law and corruption that are often obstacles to progress. So I think that the document can take a very broad view of the range of issues that are defining our times, and again, put them all into a context of where we are, what we're doing, and where we're trying to go. And so I think it's been a very useful exercise for us in the government here to assess our priorities and to think through our approach. And I think that you'll find it to be, again, a good communications document in conveying what we're doing, some of which you'll agree with, some of which you may not agree with. But I think you'll have a better understanding after reviewing it. And like I said, over the next months and years, it can continue to be something of a document to hold us accountable, to look at and to assess the progress that we've made in these different areas. Of course, we're not going to be rigid. We may adjust course in some of them. But it'll be interesting to look at this document a year from now, 2 years from now, and see how we've been doing.
That's right. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Thanks again, Ben. I think it's been a great and illuminating discussion here, and look forward to the next one.
Great. Thanks, everybody.